Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to this last webinar Wednesday. It's the last in our series of 6. And this session is on working with autobiography and mental health. I'm super excited to welcome Viv Gordon to facilitate this session. My name is Amy Bell and I'm the artist development producer at the place. And Viv is a super experienced performance and theatre maker and mental health activist. So she's someone who has done a lot of thinking, a lot of work, and supports a lot of other people in developing creative, rigorous, safe and enjoyable practice when it comes to working with autobiographical material and keeping mental health in mind. So I think this is going to be hopefully a session that opens quite a few doors in your mind, gives you a chance to reflect on your practice. And yeah, I'm going to hand you over to Viv. So thanks for joining us, Viv. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm a little bit nervous because this is a first for me to be teaching on Zoom, teaching, sharing, whatever we're doing. Yeah, so
it's a first for me. Yeah, it's a first for me as well, this series. So it's normal, I think. We're all learning.
Good, isn't it? We're all learning new stuff. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along. I'm just going to dive in because we haven't got that long. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, as Amy said. And in that time, we're going to take some little bits of time out just for self-reflection and to think about what we've been talking about. I've got a few little reflective tasks to offer. And what I'm going to do is share a little bit about my own practice, reflect on some specific challenges of dance as an embodied practice and mental health, and also offer some practical tools about setting up mental health friendly working environments. But before we do that, I thought it would be really good to just check in with ourselves. So we're just going to take like a minute or so to just check in with ourselves, see how we are right now. We might have rushed to be here on time, or we might have thoughts and feelings up about our own autobiographies or whatever's going on, just to check in, see if you're comfortable, if there's anything you need. Maybe you need some water, maybe you need some cushions, maybe you'd like to lie down. You don't need to look at me, I don't mind. So what I want is for everyone to do what they need. So let's just take a minute to do that. I'm going to do that too. And take some deep breaths and just check in with ourselves. Okay, great. Oh, that's not, I needed that. So I'll crack straight on, just introducing me and my practice a little bit. So I'm a theatre maker. The majority of my work is autobiographical. I make work about my lived experience of childhood sexual abuse and trauma and mental health. It's mainly theatre work. I'm from a dance background, but I don't really dance much anymore, but there is a movement element to my practice. So I'm 48, nearly 49, and I started making work in the last 5 or 6 years because it's taken me that time to be ready to do it. I've made 2 shows about my lived experience of childhood sexual abuse. I was halfway through making another one called Cutting Out, when all this happened. And so that's on pause at the moment. And then I've made 2 other shows that were commissions that are sort of related, that are about mental health, about animating research into mental health. But there's a lot of my autobiography woven into that. So it's not specifically about telling my story, but it's using my story as a sort of bedrock to inform the work. So my background is in dance, mainly community dance, and making some very silly outdoor dance walkabout shows, and some dance and education shows and things like that. I've worked with arts, and well, I have lifelong mental health needs myself, but I've worked with dance and mental health since 2002. I have a background in dance movement therapy. I'm not a therapist because I didn't take the training that far. I took that knowledge and skills into community dance. And then in 2009, I really specialised in dance and mental health. And I'm hesitating to use this word because it's cringe-worthy to say this about yourself, but I did do some quite groundbreaking work around access and inclusion for adults with mental health needs in dance. And then from all that learning, I started sort of applying that to my own practice, and that enabled me to start to make my own work, the work that I really wanted to make, rather than just silly things, prancing around in fields at festivals and things like that. So and the other thing I do is survivor activism. It's all sort of woven together. And so a lot of my work is about creatively articulating trauma narratives based on my lived experience. My activism is making myself visible as a survivor. And the aim of doing autobiographical creative work is to increase voice and visibility and community for survivors, and to agitate for change. So I see my work as a campaign, rather than, it's not just about me telling my story, it has a political activist motivation. I call my work autoethnographic, which is a slightly poncy word, which is why I didn't put it on the information about the session. But what it means, if for anyone who, I'm sure some of you do know already, it's a academic word about research that is using personal stories to tell cultural stories. And so for me, it's, the purpose of telling my story is to draw out wider socio-political concerns. And that's what I'm looking to do when I'm using autobiography. And then alongside all of that, I campaign for access and inclusion for artists and audiences with mental health needs. I do a lot of exploring and developing best practice in my own work and in the mentoring relationships that I have with other artists with mental health needs. And I do consultancy and training with organisations, and advocacy, writing and speaking at events and that sort of thing. So that's me. I thought we could just spend a moment reflecting on our own, thinking about this idea of autoethnography. I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, but I'm assuming that people have come today because either they've made autobiographical work, or they want to make autobiographical work, or that they use autobiography in some way in their work. And so I just thought it might be useful to spend a minute or two just thinking about the autobiographical work that you do or want to do, and how that relates to wider cultural, political concerns, sort of where that fits. So what would be really great as well is to, if you want to, completely optional, but if you want to share that at all, you could type it in can everyone type in the chat box, Amy, to share with everyone?
Yeah, people can type in the chat box, but that would go to Yumi or Eleanor. So
okay.
that's the way
So
this one's set
if
up.
you've got a pen and paper, you could write down, hold up to the camera. It'd just be really nice if you want to share anything about sort of what your stories are about, and or what your interests are, and how those relate to sort of wider cultural issues. Let's just take a minute to do that. No pressure to share at all if you don't want to.
Female oppression in Italy, someone has written. V Smith, thanks for showing yours. I can't read it, it's a bit small. I wonder if you could type that in the chat, it would help me. My experiences as a sex worker and also as a, can't read that last word, therapist? Yes, thank you. Young trauma, depression and self-harm, domestic abuse. One person's written. Another person in an R&D process, a piece called No Offence, based around LGBTQ plus issues. A solo part based on this person's own non-binary dysmorphia. Someone else has written How We Talk About Grief or Loss. Thanks everyone who's putting these up. Someone else, Gemma, I can't quite read yours, that's also quite small. Someone else has written Shame of the Body. Someone else, The Grief of Losing My Father to Cancer.
Okay.
Openly Talking About Suicide, someone else has also written.
Great.
And the last one here is My Autobiographical Experience of Trauma and the Empowerment and Unionship of Voicing or Expressing Through Art. Someone else here has put Maternal Mental Health and Postnatal Depression. Loss of a Sister, someone else has written. Internalized Racism and Assimilation to White Culture. Thanks everyone who's writing these in. It's really good to hear what people are thinking about and working on.
Yeah, really good. Thank you for sharing those. I think I've got goosebumps. It's nice to sort of know who's here, and just for us all to be mindful, I suppose, of all those issues that are in our Zoom room, and just how we can be with all of that through the next 3/4 of an hour. Great. So I'm going to carry on and talk a little bit about autobiography and mental health. And so for me, the connection between autobiography and mental health is really clear, because my work is about living with mental health needs as a result of abuse and trauma. But I think that whenever we work with autobiography, with people's stories, we're tapping into pain, sadness, grief, trauma. Very rarely make shows about everything being fine and everyone being fine and how fine everything is. So it's just good to remember that whatever we're working with, will have different resonances for people. And whenever we're asking people to draw on their own experiences, whether that's asking of ourselves if we're making self-motivated work, or if we're working with a group of artists and asking them to think about anything, it can be really innocuous, like going on holiday, you know, that could have a whole set of triggering content for somebody. So as soon as we ask people to tap into their own experience, we're potentially opening up a lot of difficult material, and we should always be mindful of that, and unfortunately we're not always. So just to sort of give a definition of trauma, I think we could talk about it in lots of different ways. I've got one here that's from a research paper saying trauma is the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds our ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved. It can stem from a single distressing event or from recurring events. Common causes include relational abuse and violence, war and genocide, accidents and illness and bereavement. But also it can stem from sort of ongoing life-limiting circumstances like living with disability, racism, homophobia, any of those things that involves societal oppression can also produce trauma and trauma responses. And so at the moment in the arts, which is really, really great, there's a lot of work coming from diverse communities, a lot of work focused on identity politics. And often that work will include, because of oppression, will include traumatic experiences such as bullying, hate crime, violence, the threat of violence, discrimination, silencing, othering, all of those things. So that's what we're dealing with autobiography. And so for me, that's all mental health needs. We all have mental health needs. And because of the way that our culture works, where, you know, there's still a lot of oppression and inequality, structural inequality, marginalisation, stigma, shame, a lot of that trauma is unprocessed, and a lot of it is ongoing and is constantly reproduced by the society that we live in. So using myself as an example, my experiences of childhood sexual abuse were a long time ago now, but my experiences of living as a survivor are every day in a culture where that's still going on a massive scale, where it's really hard to access help and support, where nobody really wants to talk about it, where people don't necessarily want to program it, all of that stuff, you know, it's like, so that is constantly reproducing my othering and my trauma. So it's just good to be mindful of that. And so I have needed to approach mental health as an access issue. Because it's a hidden disability, it's actually the largest cause of disability in the UK. It is the reason for the highest number of disability benefit claims and work absenteeism and all of that. It's massive, but we don't actually normally talk about mental health as a disability. That's not what we think of when we're thinking about disability and access. We more often talk about mental health as a well-being issue, which obviously it is, but that's just one side of the story, I think. If we look at the social model of disability, that says, this is a massive oversimplification, so I apologise for that. But it says that people are disabled not by their differences, but by structures in society that prevent equal participation. And so if we remove the barriers, we increase access and create a more level playing field. So on the most basic level, you know, if you're a wheelchair user and you can't get through the door of a space to get into the studio to make your work, then you don't have equal access. If there's a wide enough door, you do. It's very simplistic. But so that's about how in disability arts, we're thinking a lot about how do we increase access by changing working practices, changing environments, making sure they fit the people who are doing that work. In mental health, we don't think about it like that as much. We think about it more as an individualized issue, as a well-being issue, the onus is always on the individual to self-manage, to recover, to look after their own well-being without anything else changing, without any of that structural change or structural response. And that has a massive impact on access in the arts. Managing ourselves takes a lot of energy. It reduces, you know, if I'm focused on managing myself when I'm trying to make a show, then I'm going to be less productive. I'm going to be more exhausted, more likely to burn out. You know, there could be a really high personal cost. I could end up really unwell. Or I can change working practices to suit me so that I'm not putting myself at that risk or demanding that sort of extra burden of myself. What's tricky with mental health, because it's hidden, is that the barriers that I face are less tangible than somebody with a physical access need or a sensory need, you know. Although, of course, mental health crosses over all demographics. So I want to be, I'm always nervous about sort of making it sound like it's easier if you have a physical disability, because it certainly isn't. But the barriers that I face are cultural and attitudinal and semantic. So because it's still not socially acceptable to talk about abuse, it's a taboo subject, there's a lot of shame and stigma and silencing around it. That's something that I have to overcome constantly in my work, and there's no sort of change to a building that can happen that will make that better. There's only a change to the working culture that can make that easier for me. A lot of attitudes around mental health, around my trauma responses, you know, like being, you know, all the classic sort of mental health stigmatizing labels around being attention seeking, being a drama queen, being needy, being over emotional, all of those things I've internalized as well. So that's how stigma works, is we internalize it, and it means that we spend a lot of time trying to hide those things rather than being with them, and hiding them, it takes a lot of energy. And so again, it's about trying to shift a culture, shift attitudes to be more allowing of the reality of our lives as emotional beings trying to make emotional work. What I've found in my own work and with the artists I mentor is that failing to address mental health access can have really big impacts. So it means that there are voices, diverse voices are missing from a cultural narrative because it's too hard to make and sustain making and touring. It means that there's really poor representation of mental health within the arts. There's a lot of really awful, dangerous stereotypes that are reproduced because these conversations aren't being had. There's a lot of sugarcoating of mental health. There's a lot of oversimplification of mental health. There's you know, in disability arts, there's a lot of conversation about sort of nothing about us without us, and we're a million miles away from that with mental health, because it just seems like fair game for anyone to make a show about mental health, whether they have any lived experience or not, whether they've done any research or not. It's just sort of seen as a dramatic thing to tap into without actually connecting with the lived experience, the knowledge and expertise that come from lived experience. I've known quite a few artists with mental health needs to leave the industry. I've known people to become really unwell during a making process. I've known people to be hospitalised, and I have known people who have died by suicide as a result of sort of pushing their vulnerability too far without good support in place, without their access needs being met. So it really is, that's what's motivating the campaign for greater access and inclusion is to try and shift all of that. So just to give an example very briefly, in 2007 I tried to make a show. Would have been really great. It was a great idea. It was about dissociative identity disorder, which is what we used to call multiple personality disorder, which is, I haven't got that, but I'm on that spectrum. I don't really like any of the labels anyway, but my mental health is a dissociative condition, and I was doing that without any support. And I'm just going to, because I want to move on, but it just became really unsustainable. I was getting really emotional. I was crying a lot. I was trying to write the evaluation report and I couldn't stop crying, and collaborators were worried about me and didn't know if it was all right to continue working and things like that. And in the end, I just stopped doing it because I didn't know how else to do it. And so after I had spent quite a lot of time in the community dance context looking at access and inclusion, I came back to making my own work in 2014, so 7 years later, and I applied everything that I had been looking at in community dance with other people to myself, and put a lot of different support in place. I'd really connected with the disability arts scene by then, and so I was sort of looking at how other people did it, and I had a fellowship with an organisation called G Dance, who are a disability dance organisation in Gloucestershire, who sadly have now closed. But they were really good, and they had one key question that they would just keep coming back to, and it was really hard for me to answer, but it was, what do you need to make your best work? And so that I'd offer that as a question. We're going to have a bit of time to think about that in a minute. But I'd offer that as a question to ask yourself regularly and to ask your collaborators regularly. And so what I did was I started to get access support. And for me, and I started to shape our working practices differently. So for me, that meant that I had therapy paid for through projects to see me through making, touring, all of that. I decided that if I had a different disability, that I would potentially have a personal assistant, an artist assistant, accompanying me on projects. And so I had no idea what I was going to do with them, but I just decided I was going to try out having one. So I was making a show called I Am Joan, and through the R&D was as much about what does access look like for me as about making the show. So it was sort of learning by doing. So I worked with an artist assistant and found out what that did for me. It was amazing. I completely adjusted the working environment. So everyone on the team, if they came in for half a day to if they were there throughout, was briefed by me on my mental health needs, on the language I preferred, on things that I was concerned about. So one of my biggest concerns was that people would treat me differently. So some of that was about going, look, I've got all this support in place so that I can just crack on and do my job. And I don't want you to pussyfoot around me. I want you to ask me challenging questions. I want you to challenge the content, all of that. And so, but then also I let people know the things that could happen, like if I dissociate, I'm really chatty when I'm dissociated, so nobody knows, because that's been survival for me, is to hide it. And so it's up to me to notice if that's happening, if I'm not really there anymore, not really present. I'm not going to do good work in that space. So I tell everyone that might happen, and as soon as I notice that that's what's happened, I take some time out. I go for a walk with my artist assistant. Everyone on the team knows that might happen, so they all have jobs up their sleeves so that they can just crack on with working while I do what I need to do until I'm ready to come back. So I'm constantly worried about wasting public funding by stopping the process. So I just brief everyone that might happen and that they should have things that they can do. I could talk about this for hours, and I'm really aware of the time. We have an access contingency for if anyone else on the team is triggered by the content in whatever way or needs a bit of support. And then once we got further on in the process, we were looking at touring is a whole nother kettle of fish for me. I found out that I can't drive after a show. I found that out by driving the wrong way round a roundabout. And that's to do with the way that adrenaline interacts with my mental health needs. And that's a really ungrounded space for me. So the adrenaline of performing. And so part of my artist assistant role is to drive me to and from shows. Again, the being chatty while I'm dissociating thing happened. We found everything out the hard way, but happened with like going into a show, everyone thinking, oh, Viv's in a good space today, and then it getting to 7:30 and me just being like not really knowing where I was, not being at all ready to perform. And so now I'm on like a 3-hour schedule before a show that's managed by my assistant, and to make sure I've eaten, to make sure I've warmed up, to make sure I've done any checks I need to do. I do boxing just before the show and do quite a lot of swearing and things, and that just gets me in the right space to perform. So there's loads of different things. We did things like mental health awareness training for all the venues that we went to, so that one, they knew what my needs might be, but also that they were able to welcome diverse audiences in an appropriate and support audiences in an appropriate way. And one of the other things we found out from that first show, which we really gave a lot of focus to access to managing that and learning throughout, was about the aftermath. So there's always a bit of a come down after a show. When you're making a show or touring a show that's about your own personal story, there's it's different. You know, I've toured other work, so I know what that's like. I know it's tiring and everything, but it's really different when you've shared of yourself, made yourself vulnerable in that way. Brené Brown calls it a vulnerability hangover, which I think is great. I think Amy's posting in the chat, there's a couple of TED Talks by her that I just think are really great, about how to be with our own vulnerability. So I really crash after a tour. I really crash, and I'm exhausted because I've given out so much and really pushed my vulnerability in a manageable way because of all the support I have. But what I'm starting to do is to build in paid time after projects that are recovery time, to make sure any access support is still available to me after a project, to make sure I don't timetable things too close together, all of those sorts of things. So really gone for it in trying to be very 360 with the support. And I'm telling you all of that because what I want to give you is a sense of possibility in terms of what the Arts Council will support. Their approach with me has been very much like, you tell us what good looks like because we don't know. You know, maybe they know a bit more now than they did a few years ago, but they were like, just tell us what you need because we don't know. There's no roadmap. So yeah. So I just wanted to invite us all again to just take a couple of minutes to think about what do I need, to ask ourselves, what do I need to make my best work and to feel safe and supported? So again, if you want to share anything, you could hold it up, or if you just want to take a couple of minutes to reflect on your own, then that's also good. Okay, so I'm just gonna. I feel like that task is something that you might answer over the next 5 years. I mean, that's the the that's the question I'm asking myself all the time, and it changes, and my access needs change and evolve, and so I think that's something to have running in the background whenever you're dealing with autobiographical content, your own or others, of just what's needed, what do I need, what do they need. So I'm seeing the time, and I'm going to ramble quite quickly through the next bit, which is about sort of specific challenges of dance, around dance and mental health. So because dance is a body-based practice, and our bodies are the sites of trauma. That's where everything happens. That's where we feel everything. That's where all our experiences are stored. And in dance in particular, bodies are the site of our creativity and the site of our performance. And so that's a particular interaction that is quite a heady mix, I think. Well, that doesn't make sense as body heady. The underpinning idea behind dance movement therapy is that the body and mind are in constant reciprocal interaction, and so what the body has experienced is experiencing is impacting on our mind, and what's going on in our mind is impacting on our body, and there's a sort of range of somatic impacts of and physical impacts of mental health and trauma that we're carrying in our bodies. I'm sure some of you will have read or heard of The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. There's a link in the chat. It's quite a important book. It's not perfect, but it's quite an important book about and a well-known book, an accessible book about bodies and trauma. Just got a quick quote from that book, and it says, "Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control these processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. The more people try to push away and ignore internal warning signs, the more likely they are to take over and leave them bewildered, confused, and ashamed." So that's kind of saying much better what I was saying earlier about that if we're constantly having to hide and self-manage what's going on, that we're much more likely to become unwell, our practice is more likely to become unsustainable, things are going to start going wrong. So it's just a good sort of affirmation of the need to create spaces where, I mean, we can't really make work if we're numbing our awareness, can we? So we can't make good work if we're numbing our awareness. We can make sort of rehashing the same old ideas kind of work with numbed awareness maybe. But, it's my true belief that if we can bring our whole selves to our work, then we're going to make the best work we can make. I think in dance there's some interesting ideas around professionalism that maybe don't play out so much in other art forms, but particularly around sort of leaving our problems at the door, being constantly willing, not talking about, dance as a mute culture where we don't really talk about what's going on. We're sort of expected to shut up and get on with it. I know that's not the case in all processes, but there's that sort of element to it. And then there's a lot of stuff, isn't there, about dancers being disposable. It's very, very competitive field, and so there's this pressure to be on top form, to always be ready to work, and actually that conflicts with the potential need to take time out, or to stop, or to take more time to reflect. And so I just think that's something to sort of be aware of, and culturally somewhere where dance needs to shift. A lot of the power relationships in a rehearsal room can replicate oppressive, traumatic power relationships in life. And so again, it's about how do we shift a culture and be more mindful of that. I hear all the time about processes where dancers are asked to draw on their lived experience, and then they don't have any there's no consent, there's no ownership of their own stories. So people will share something, and then a choreographer will go, oh yeah, that's great, I'll just take that, and then I want to do this with it. And there's no it doesn't have to take lots of time to do that in a more consensual, mindful way, where somebody feels that their content is being valued and respected, rather than exploited. And so I think that those are things to think about. We could spend a lot of time just thinking about that. I'm going to wrap up in a minute so that we can do questions and things, but I'm just going to I talked a little bit about some of the ways I address my own access needs in my practice, and then just to sort of think a little bit more generally about that before we go into questions. First of all, I think it's really important to understand why you're making autobiographical work. I always say, don't make a show instead of having therapy. If you need therapy, I mean, I need therapy to make my work. You can have both, it's not either or. But if what you really most need is therapy, do that first. Don't make a show to try and work your stuff out. I think as well, I mean, no one wants to see therapy on stage either, really, do they? Because it's just, that's all the things that can go wrong about, and it's just not very safe for the artist either. I think it's really important to own your own relationship with your work. So, for example, if you're making work about bereavement, and you need to, and you've experienced bereavement, then you need to understand how your experience is interacting with the content that you're producing. It doesn't mean that you have to own it publicly. You don't have to tell everyone this is about me, but somewhere there needs to be a space where you can go, oh, there's this interaction going on between what I'm working on and my own lived experience. And you need somewhere, even if that's not in the rehearsal room, to unpick that. It's all up to you how you use your content. You don't just be, so my thing is to go, here I am, I'm a survivor, because that's my activism. But that's not necessarily how we use autobiographical content. Sometimes it's informing things in more subtle ways, but it is really good just to make sure you've got a space where you can make those connections. I think, and this is just my opinion, but good reasons to make autobiographical work are that you feel ready and emotionally stable. You've processed your own feelings about an experience to a certain extent. You've done some work on them already, and so you know where you're coming from with them. You have a clear purpose in making the work, which might be something that you want to say politically. For me, that's a really good sort of, it depersonalizes it a little bit, although it's very, very personal. It's also that there's this other motivation going on, and that you have support and know how to look after yourself and your company while you explore difficult content. So feeling emotionally stable and ready, having already done a bit of work on your experiences in a safe space, having a clear purpose with making the work that you want to make, and having support in place. Those are like top tips. Good reasons to stop or pause are that you're feeling consistently overwhelmed, anxious, or emotional. Can always pause a show. Always, always, always. Doesn't matter if you've got dates booked or any, I know companies that have contingencies in their budget for if they have to cancel a show at the last minute because they don't feel well enough, and they just cover the cost of the, of the fee that they would have got. So you can always cancel and pause, and well-being should always come first. Another good reason to stop or pause is if you're reaching for unhealthy coping mechanisms in an unmanageable way. So if you're noticing, if starting to self-harm, or reaching for addictions or disordered eating, or whatever it is that are your coping mechanisms, it's a really good reason to stop or pause. Last thing, just running through this, I mean, we can spend hours on any of these things, but just some quick tools to remember. I can share these notes as well if there's a way of doing that. Doing check-ins and check-outs at the beginning and end of sessions, so that we can bring our whole selves to the room. Finding different ways of providing support through a process. So I know people who always have a therapist in the room when they're working. I always have my artist assistant in the room, and then I have my therapy outside of the studio space. I know companies that have like a set X number of hours booked with a therapist, and any member of the company can just book in for some time whenever they need it. There's different ways of doing that. I think some of the biggies are things like having permission to stop and take time. So always putting that in, that anyone can stop at any time for any reason. They don't need to explain themselves. Just if that's what you need to do that. Work smarter, not harder. It's that thing, isn't it, of like, work when you're in a space to work, and when you need to step back, and find ways of making that all right in your company. Thinking really carefully about how we introduce and manage challenging content. If there's a particular scene in a show that is going to be difficult, take time to check in before you do it about how are we going to do this, what are the parameters around it, what are we trying to achieve, what if we want to stop, how are we going to, so for me, I find, I just, on my show Oral, there were bits where someone had to stand just behind me. That's really, really triggering for me. It's something that could easily be missed. Wouldn't think like, oh, that's going to be really difficult for someone, but it is for me. And so every time we came to that scene where someone was standing really close behind me, don't even like thinking about it. We just thought about, how am I in the right space to do that? Is this the right time? Are there the right people in the room? Let's try it once and then have a break. Let's then try it again. So it's just sort of thinking mindfully about how to approach that content. Lots of taking our time, processing as we go. And then finally, just about sort of really managing consent and ownership in the room. So on any show that I'm working on, I invite lots of collaborators to come and work with me, and I want all their brilliance, but I have final say on everything because it's my story. So I have a brilliant director that I work with, and he facilitates a lot of the process. He brings loads of content as well, and loads of ideas and all of that. But at the end of the day, he might think something's great. If it's not speaking to me, it's not in. And so it's always that I have that sense of ownership of my own story. There's lots and lots of different ways of managing that as well in a more sort of group situation. But yeah, I'm going to stop talking.
Amazing. Thank you, Viv. I hope that's opened up a lot of possibility for people, and so much of what you say is kind of stigma busting as well. Seems to be a lot of it. So if people have got questions, do drop those in the chat. There's a couple I've got here. Somebody saying, do you know where I can access cheap therapy for artists? Because obviously private therapy can be quite expensive.
There is at the moment, and I don't have the link, but I could send it to Amy and she could forward it on to everyone, because there is a scheme at the moment, isn't there, through lockdown, where there's mental health support available for free.
Yes, I think that's like short sessions.
Yeah. I'm afraid I don't, though, and it probably depends a bit where you're based. But what I would say is that you can build the cost of therapy into any project budget, and as an access cost. So that would be additional, like with the Arts Council, if you're applying for under 15 grand, most of my under 15 grand budgets are more like 17 or 18 grand, because all of my access is put in there.
Yeah.
And I'd really encourage you to do it.
Yeah, I also see quite a lot of applications where things like that are built in, so don't be afraid to ask for what you need, like you were saying earlier. Eleanor was saying about there are salary match centres. I suppose that's if you're on a salary, which some people may or may not be, but I don't know if you want to just speak to that quickly, Eleanor.
Yes, I'm aware of a few centres that essentially they have a sliding scale, and you're able to say what you can afford, and in my experience they don't question you on that. So I've got that info if anyone's interested.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful. There's quite a few questions here. So just building on that one about building it into mental health support into your ACE application. When planning for the application, do you need to have been diagnosed with something? As far as I'm aware, that's not, you don't have to, do you, Viv?
No, I don't have a formal diagnosis, because I'm a service dodger. I don't, for my own reasons, don't want to engage with mental health services. So I know what it would be if I chose to have one. I've chosen not to have one. I don't really agree with the whole labelling thing either. So no is the answer. You don't. The way that I started was I just had a meeting with the diversity relationship manager at Arts Council Southwest, which is where I'm based. She was just amazing. I was just like, this is what I need. I can't make my work without it. It's obvious, really, isn't it? Okay, I'm making work about sexual abuse. It's obvious that I'm going to need some support. And so no one's ever asked me to prove anything. At the moment, I'm going through a process as well of applying for access to work, and which is a government scheme to support disabled people in the workplace, and you don't need a diagnosis for that either.
Thanks, that's really helpful, I think, or hope. Someone was also asking, in regard to taking ownership of your idea or your material, I suppose, how do you facilitate that clarity in the room without disregarding an artist's input? So if you feel like, no, this is my story, I don't want to do it that way or whatever, how do you do that and still, I guess, retain like a respectful working relationship, or not make them feel disregarded?
Well, I hope I don't make anyone feel disregarded. They come back and work with me some more, so I'm assuming I don't. But I think it's about setting that up from the get-go. So there's a really clear understanding from the start, before anyone's in the room, even from the minute we start talking to collaborators about how it's going to work. And I'm really open-minded. Like, I want in a making process, I want to sort of go around and come back to something and try lots of different things. So I'm never sort of like, I mean, there are things I don't want to do, but generally I'm up for trying lots and lots of different things, and then I'm taking those things away and reflecting on them and finding the bits that resonate with me within them. And so often what ends up in a show is a real collage of lots of different people's content, and it's just understood from the get-go that I'm going to have that final say. I still want to be directed. I still want everyone to bring all their creativity and ideas to the process, but no one's ever questioned it. Or my experience is that artists are really, really generous, and also that things, you know, that there might be ideas that come up in the room that I don't want to pursue, but that maybe they do, and so they find their way into other projects or future projects with me, or, you know, so it's never been an issue for me. And I think just there's a really high level of communication on all my projects, where we're constantly sort of checking in about all that stuff and making sure everyone feels heard and valued. Yeah,
and I guess setting that up from the start really helps with that.
The worst thing, just to add to that, the worst thing is when that's what you want but you're not saying it. Yeah. Because then you are dismissing people and not explaining why. But if you've set it up from the beginning, it's always been fine for me.
Yeah. Again, that's really helpful. Thank you, Viv, and thanks for the questions. Connected to that, I guess, on the other, when the shoe is on the other foot, do you have advice for dancers who feel they're not able to manage consent or ownership of their story? So the example being, like, you've shared something in the studio and the choreographer's using it in a way that doesn't feel respectful to you. Do you have advice for someone in that position? Because the power dynamic is often so different.
So hard.
It's quite hard to take ownership when you're, you know, you can feel that your job is at risk or your position in the project is at risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's an area that I know less about. What I would say is that any company should have access support available for, you know, like if you break your ankle, you get physio or whatever, don't you? And it's like actually you know, so you could ask for some access support, mental health access support, and explain that it's to do with the content that you're bringing to the studio, and so that you've at least got a safe space to deal with it. I think you know, that particular question is like you know, right at the nub of the problem in the culture of the arts, and how material is used and how our personal material is seen as fair game. And I'm really gutted to say that I don't sort of have answers to that yet, but I think through a series of conversations that you know, and over time that will change and it will become more possible to challenge that. I guess you know, it's really hard, isn't it? Because I could say, oh, you know, have a conversation about how content is used before you say yes to the job, but we all need to work, don't we? And so it's just that power dynamic is really, really tricky, and is something that is going to have to change over time, I believe. But sorry, I don't have a better solution other than to make sure that you have support yourself to be with that.
I mean, and that's part of why someone like you decided to make your own creative space as well. You know, if you find yourself in those situations, like maybe there's other options, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, if you run your own projects, then, I mean, I don't run, you know, I have producers that I work with and things. So that doesn't mean you have to do everything. Yeah. But if you initiate your own projects, then you have a lot more control over what you do. Yeah. And you know, there is work happening. I'm doing a lot of work with Stuart Waters at the moment around sort of getting cultural change in the dance sector. You know, so that's a conversation that is happening. So do sort of keep in touch with that, and because the more of us, the better, asking for those changes.
Absolutely, yeah. And then maybe as a last question here, someone is like, how do I work with trauma but resist the commodification of trauma, or like trauma clowning? Trauma clowning, actually, that was a phrase that if anyone knows the artist Alexandrina Hemsley, that's a phrase that she introduced me to. I don't know if you can speak to that at all, Viv. So that feeling of, like, I don't know, having ownership of your material and working with trauma, but not sort of playing into that thing that your worth as an artist is increased if you bear more of your trauma or perform it more. I don't know if you're able to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can a bit. I think it's a really fine line, isn't it? And so it is that thing about making sure that you have very trusted collaborators, both in the sort of support team and in the creative team, to help you sort of sense check what you're putting out. You know, it's really hard. It's really, really hard to get that right, I think. You know, some of it is about being really mindful of how we're using humor, particularly in work. There's a lot of humor in my work, and we have to think really carefully about why do we want the audience to laugh now? Is it because usually I want the audience to laugh to open them up so I can go for the jugular with some really gutting material straight afterwards, so they're like, oh fuck. that's what I want from a laugh. But what happens a lot when we're dealing with trauma is that artists use humor to back away from their own material, to sort of dampen it or lessen it. And so yeah, it's really interesting. I'm having quite a few conversations at the moment about this area, about sort of, I've had people come to my shows and go, I want to see more of you and I want to know more. And it's like, well, I'm telling you what I want to tell you. And I've spent, 2 years thinking about what I want to tell you. And often it's white, straight men, unfortunately, who say things like that, where it's like, well, I just wanted to see more of you. So it is just about sort of having all the way through a process a really clear understanding of what it is you want to say. That's where the political motivation behind my work really helps, because I'm never on stage going, look at me and my tragic life, look at me and my trauma. I'm always on stage saying, look at you and our culture and how this isn't allowed. And so having that political motivation behind it kind of frees me up from some of that, because does that make sense? I don't know that I've really answered the question, but
that makes a lot of sense. It's something for me, like the difference when I'm in the audience, of seeing when you feel genuinely worried for someone, you feel they've created a situation in which they're not having a good time. That doesn't feel like a good experience for anyone. So yeah, something about that clarity, that preparation, and like the awareness, I suppose, of what it is you're doing and why the work before you even set foot on the stage is really important. Great. I think we'll probably leave it there, Viv, as we've just gone slightly over time. But
great.
I just want to say a massive thank you for an absolutely brilliant session.
Thank you.
Really rich and really powerful. Thank you. And we're going to say goodbye to you. And then if the participants, if you'd like to hang around and drop any feedback to me in the chat, that would be really helpful. So Viv, we'll say goodbye to you now, and I'll give you a ring in a minute. So cool.
Bye now.
Thank you, Viv.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Good luck with all your projects.
Bye.